Good morning, everybody on Facebook. Ryan Bohl here with the RANE Network, and I'm here with our cybersecurity analyst, Ali. How do you say your last name, Ali? Ali Plusinski?
Fuczynski.
Pluchinski. And we are going to be discussing cyber threats and how information kind of works in the cyberspace in periods of unrest, and how governments try to control that information, kind of tactics that individual dissenters use to try to get around those government safeguards. And we're tracking a lot of these things that are happening with popular unrest in Iran, in phases in China, in Russia, and intermittently in Venezuela. So there's no shortage of countries where this phenomenon of kind of cat and mouse game is underway, where protesters are trying to find ways to organize and governments are trying to prevent them from doing so through technology. So Ali, why don't you walk us through some of the technical aspects that you spend a lot of your time tracking?
I'd be happy to. I think two good case studies to sort of talk about this cat and mouse game of government versus domestic protests are in Iran and China, where following the outbreak of protests in Iran after the death of Mahsa Amini, you saw protesters taking to the streets, and typically social media platforms and access to technological platforms overall can be really essential to bolstering a protest initiative. And of course, governments naturally look to immediately tamp down on those platforms, engage in internet blackouts, or overall obstruct access for citizens to get onto those platforms. And so Iran, I think the role of both individual users but also hacktivists was really pronounced. For individual users, you saw a lot of activists from outside of the country trying to give domestic protesters information on what kinds of proxy servers they should use, Tor browsers, to sort of make sure that they were still able to connect with information about the ongoing protests. And then, of course, you had hacktivists, including Anonymous, the prolific and well-known international group, declare war on the Iranian government and engage in these distributed denial of service attacks against various websites, including the Iranian president's website, the National Bank's website, the news agency. And, distributed denial of service attacks aren't necessarily extraordinarily damaging, but, they definitely have a symbolic impact and can really undermine, for example, the Iranian government attempt to display itself as in control of the situation, and I think can really boost morale for domestic protesters. More recently, there was another group called Black Reward that claims to be a domestic Iranian group that was able to hack into an agency connected to Iran's nuclear program and leak some of that data, which of course can have reverberating national security implications for the Iranian government and for those nuclear programs. So I think it's important not to undermine the role of those hacktivists, but also individual users contributing to the overall wave of protests that are still ongoing there.
Right. And when we think about state strategies, when they're dealing with protests like in Iran, the Iranian government's current imperative is to prevent these protests from emerging into a political movement, not a political movement that could then split the government, get some sympathizers amongst the elites. And if that happens, we enter into a revolutionary phase, a potential civil war phase. And so what they need to do is keep disrupting them. And the online space is such a key battleground these days, because that's where a lot of these narratives of the anti-government, pro-government narratives are shaped and shifted. In the Iranian case, they try to simply suppress them. They want to make sure that people are simply being apolitical or being pro-government. And the freer the online space is, the more the anti-government narratives can become sophisticated. They can be more nuanced. And if that enters, if the protest movement enters that phase where they go beyond slogans and they start building political programs, and that happens online in spaces like Telegram. In the Arab Spring, a lot of it happened on Twitter. That's where you start to see a real threat to the regime. So this is where these governments have this strong imperative to make sure that the internet is not a place where somebody can write down a manifesto that's convincing enough to convince some of the people working in the government to join with that movement, because that's when we see governments actually falling down. It's exactly what we saw during the Arab Spring, where after the events of Tunisia, everybody was talking about democracy and they were sharing it online, and places like the Egyptian government didn't have a handle on social media. It was still a relatively new phenomenon for them. And so when those protesters came out in Tahrir Square, manifestos had been written, and people found them convincing, and so did people within the Egyptian army found some of them convincing enough that they turned on the Egyptian president and helped oust him. And that's kind of what we're watching for in places like Iran and also within China. Although China is an interesting example from a technical standpoint because of the things like the Great Firewall, this authoritarian, almost totalitarian approach to the internet. And can you talk through some of the dynamics that we see within the Chinese protest movement and how the Chinese government attempts to win the battlefield in the information space?
Absolutely. And to your point, the Chinese firewall definitely makes the case study of China a very different one from Iran, where, typically Chinese citizens can only access very limited information within their own domestic cyberspace. And so when the protests began to break out following the stringent COVID-19 measures, you saw a huge influx of Chinese citizens moving to Western social media platforms like Twitter to try to get more reliable and accurate information about what was going on. And I thought a really interesting maneuver by the Chinese government to combat that influx of Chinese citizens moving to Western content was that they flooded, for example, the Twitter platform with various ads and scams that were completely unrelated to anything about the protests, but they purposely flooded these fake advertisements with tags to various Chinese cities. And so as a Twitter user, if you searched the name of a Chinese city like Shanghai or anywhere else, instead of finding information about the protests, you would instead just get page after page of these useless scams that didn't pertain at all to that information. And some security experts really looked into that activity and found that a lot of those accounts that were posting those advertisements were very likely bots and had been sort of quiet and not very active in quite a long period of time. But then when these protests began, they became really active to try to obfuscate information for Chinese citizens domestically. Another really interesting tactic that Chinese citizens responded with, because a lot of the ways in which the Chinese government is able to scan for dissident content on their own internet is by using artificial intelligence. And so to combat that, a lot of citizens were doing one of two things. Firstly, they were posting videos at different angles or with filters on them, or, for example, turning the video so that it was sideways, because that's much more difficult for some machine learning algorithms to quickly detect and then be able to take down. And so these tactics were able to allow users to spread more content for a longer period of time before it was detected and taken down by Chinese authorities. Another tactic that Chinese citizens used to outsmart artificial intelligence was to use sarcasm. This was sort of mirrored during the street protests, where a lot of Chinese citizens just held up white pieces of paper in protest, because that was a symbolic representation of censorship itself. Just a white piece of paper. How can you punish someone or arrest someone for a blank piece of paper? They did the same thing on social media platforms, where they would just tweet or post messages that just said, okay, sure, good, as a very limited but definitely still pronounced protest against censorship in China.
Right, and that's what's so interesting is it's almost like the phenomenon that we heard of quiet quitting. People refusing to allow themselves to be burned out, and so they start to do things quietly. And and we see that in authoritarian and totalitarian spaces like China, like Iran, like Russia, where they try to come up with clever ways to express dissent that flirts with the line of the government, but doesn't actually cross it, so that they can't be charged with something criminal. And this is, I think, this is a big challenge for a lot of these regimes, these states, in controlling dissent. Is that dissent in online spaces can become so nuanced and can become so specific. Symbols of resistance can appear out of nowhere. These memes travel at the speed of light here. And so as a result, something that was innocuous, like a blank piece of paper, can suddenly become a galvanizing symbol. And this is one of the reasons that I think that a lot of these governments are, resorting to things rather than just brutally arresting everybody or shooting into the crowd, the way that we saw totalitarian or authoritarian governments do in the past. Now they're doing something like more of those clever, counter protest movements, make the platform unusable. People say, if you want to overthrow a government, become ungovernable. Well, the governments are replying with, well, let's make all these platforms unusable. Let's make the internet such an annoying place to be in, that it's not an effective place to organize. There's another thing that I'd like to talk about, though, in terms of narrative shifting and narrative shaping, where we hear this a lot, where your governments are accused of narrative shaping opposition movements and in online spaces against their enemies. So there's no doubt the Chinese have accused the United States of trying to protest there, and the CIA is involved. From a technical standpoint, thinking about some of the tactics that are used in that, what are the things that people are looking for, and what are the ways that you can kind of tell that a narrative shaping operation is underway?
Do you mean, for example, that either the US or another Western company is purposely using information campaigns to influence the domestic protests in that country?
Yeah, I think maybe it's more of an analytical question for us internally. Like, how do we tell when a narrative is authentic, and how do we tell when a narrative is coming from a foreign government? Because it can be useful to know that if it's grassroots authentic, that tells us something about the stability of the government. That tells us about the politics and the social conditions. If it's coming from an external source, it's a distraction for us. If we see a bunch of people demanding democracy in China, but that's not actually what Chinese want, then all of a sudden we have a narrative of like, well, that's not what really is going on inside of China.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. It's rather philosophical. I think to your point, I think there's still a way where you can tell if something's genuine or ingenuine, really based off of the grassroots activity going on and whether or not it's supporting those narratives that you're seeing in online spaces. Because I would say that a lot of disinformation campaigns really still fall short if there's not already that natural proclivity or sentiment existing in that country. So I think disinformation campaigns or information campaigns overall always seek to exploit pre-existing grievances. That's a warning that Microsoft has put out recently about Russia's activity this winter in Europe, where because so many citizens are already struggling with increased energy costs and overall inflation, Russia's really going to try to target that specific grievance of those high energy costs and high cost of living to sow division among the Western Bloc and ultimately try to undermine support for the Western war effort, or the Ukrainian war effort rather. But you can see where those crack lines are that they're targeting, in the same way that I think, if the West is engaging in an information campaign in another country, there has to be the basis of that sentiment already existing on the ground for those information campaigns to be successful. And if those grievances aren't really there, then those information campaigns fall flat. This summer, Meta took down a disinformation campaign being run by the Chinese that was targeting Western cyberspace. But almost everybody that interacted with those fake accounts knew that they were fake, because the ideas that they were expressing just really there wasn't enough cultural similarities in the information campaigns to really be a selling point for the Western audience. So I think information campaigns really depend on knowing the audience and then targeting those grievances. And if they're not doing that, then they're not successful.
And that is what's so interesting when you think about these state-backed efforts and how some of them fall flat. It also helps when people are kind of thinking about how they're critical thinking for media, critical thinking towards narratives. There can be an assumption that states can just create dissent out of nowhere. And I think Iran gives us a really good example, because there's a protest movement right now that's quite authentic. There's an online movement for a group called the MEK, which is kind of an extremist Iranian opposition movement. There's also a lot of pro-royalist sentiment online, and most of it's what we would refer to as astroturfed. It's fake. It's a bunch of bots replying and retweeting each other, making it look like Iran wants the Shah back. But most Iranians don't want that, and that's something that's a clear example for us. We know that most Iranians on the ground would not welcome a return of the absolute monarchy that was overthrown 40 years ago. But there are so many other examples of that out there. Even within Russia, you can see some of this wishful thinking that people believe because of the online narratives that Putin is in a vulnerable position domestically, that he might be subject to a democratic revolution, that Russians are unwilling to go along with his war effort or the mobilization efforts. And the reality is, on the ground in Russia, a lot of these online narratives simply don't connect with real people. And that I think is also something that, when foreign governments are looking to fan the flames of protest, as you noted, they have to find things that are actually happening on the ground. And in some ways, China and Russia have been very good at fanning those flames. In other ways, sometimes it has fallen flat and it hasn't been as successful as they were hoping for. I guess with a final few minutes here, I'm not sure if anybody has any questions to ask either of us about these dynamics of information warfare or protest movements or anything like that. But we're more than willing to take some questions from the audience. And if not, we can call it for a Friday and keep it short and sweet.
Thank you for the wonderful discussion.
Yeah, thank you for joining me, Ali.